Hello, friends! I am glad to see you again. Today I will tell you about a neighbor who says that my warehouse is shared property. I've always been a private person and I never planned on airing my issues with my neighbors to anyone beyond my close circle, but the events of the last year have been so extraordinary that I feel like I need to share them somewhere, even if only to let others know how wild neighbor disputes can get. My property sits on the edge of a quiet suburban area, not too far from a mid-sized city. I purchased it with the intent to store equipment for my small contracting business. And I was beyond happy at first because it seemed I had struck gold with my large lot, well-constructed warehouse, and a peaceful community where everyone was cordial at best and indifferent at worst. Little did I know that a single new neighbor would turn everything upside down. When I first moved in, I spent my time meeting a few folks on the street, but most everyone kept to themselves. The homes here are spaced out nicely, and each has its own fencing setup that usually includes a tall privacy fence in the back. My place was a bit unusual because beyond the house, I also owned a separate warehouse building located toward the back of my land. That warehouse was my main reason for buying the property. I envisioned it as the perfect spot for my business inventory. Things like ladders, spare lumber, specialty tools, and other materials that wouldn't fit in a standard garage. The previous owner had used it for classic car storage, so it was in excellent shape, equipped with a strong security system and sturdy shutters on the windows. In the early days, life in this neighborhood felt like a dream come true. My contracting business was doing well. I had ample storage space, a neat office corner inside the warehouse for administrative tasks, and more than enough privacy to come and go as I pleased, without disturbing anyone. My nearest neighbor on one side, an older gentleman named Patton, was perfectly content with greeting me from time to time over the fence. He'd sometimes wave hello if he saw me tinkering in the yard, but never pushed for conversation. There was also the Jenkins family at the far end of the street with two excited kids who'd wave when I pulled out of my driveway each morning. Apart from that, the entire atmosphere was exactly what I had hoped for: a calm, private environment, conducive to running a home-based business and enjoying suburban life. The turning point came when a new neighbor moved in directly adjacent to the warehouse side of my property. Let's call her Amelia. At first, I thought Amelia seemed friendly enough. She popped by on her first day to introduce herself, asking how I liked the community. I told her everything had been smooth sailing so far, and she responded that she was delighted to have found such a welcoming place. Our conversation was pleasant, if a bit superficial. Just the usual small talk about local grocery stores, community parks, and the trash pickup schedule. She told me she was semi-retired, used to work in some administrative capacity for a private real estate company, and now wanted a quieter lifestyle. She also mentioned how fortunate she was to have discovered a place where she could really spread out, though her property wasn't particularly large by normal standards. Nonetheless, we parted ways on good terms, each returning to our move-in tasks for her and daily chores for me. Not even 2 weeks later, Amelia knocked on my door, wearing this broad, confident smile. She was carrying a file folder bulging with papers. I invited her in, assuming she might have questions about local utilities or maybe just wanted to chat more in depth. However, as soon as I guided her to my living room, she spread out a map of the neighborhood on my coffee table. The map looked like something you might get from a county records office, an overhead view of property lines, streets, and lot numbers. Still, I immediately noticed something odd. Many of the lines appeared to have been traced over with a thick black pen, making them bolder than usual. In fact, there were new lines around the warehouse portion of my property that didn't match any official maps I'd seen when I purchased the place. She made a grand gesture over that portion and claimed, "I just wanted to show you how the original plan for the neighborhood designated that corner with the warehouse as a kind of common utility area. From everything I've researched, it was meant to be shared by the previous owner and my property's previous owners." As politely as I could, I pointed out that I had never encountered such an arrangement in my purchase documents. The idea of a common utility area had never come up, and if such a major detail existed, I'm pretty sure my realtor or the title company would have flagged it. Yet, Amelia persisted. She insisted that her real estate background gave her special insight, that she had discovered these old neighborhood records, and that the warehouse was effectively open for joint use. Her intentions were soon made crystal clear. She demanded that I install a new gate right at the back of my warehouse fence, giving her direct access from her property into my warehouse's perimeter. According to her, this was just restoring the historical arrangement. She wanted a locked gate, but she insisted she should have her own key. When I pressed her as to why she needed direct access, she explained that she planned to do some personal projects, like storing gardening equipment, perhaps even setting up a small workshop if I would allow it. The entire notion took me by complete surprise. I felt it was unbelievably audacious that someone I had only recently met would claim such a major portion of my property and propose construction that would give her indefinite access. Her maps did not look official in the least. Besides the odd line thickness, there were what appeared to be pencil erasures in a couple of spots, as though she'd changed certain lines multiple times. One area was even circled, presumably highlighting her property lines that she claimed extended well into the warehouse grounds. When I asked if she had any formal documentation or official county records to back up these claims, she dodged the question. Instead, she repeated something about finding the rightful boundaries and making it correct once and for all. I kept my composure and explained that as far as I knew, the warehouse and the land it sat on were 100% mine, fully deeded, surveyed, and recorded. If she had legitimate evidence to the contrary, she needed to go through the proper legal channels. I told her I had no intention of installing a gate based on a pen-marked map that directly contradicted my own purchase documents. That conversation set off an entire chain of escalating confrontations. After I politely showed her the door that day, Amelia continued her campaign with letters, which she would stuff in my mailbox or slip under my front door. Each letter argued that I was obliged to honor the neighborhood's original planning, though not one of them provided any new or verifiable documentation. She threatened to call the local authorities on me if I didn't comply. Then she approached other neighbors, describing me as someone who was refusing to cooperate with a long-standing neighborhood agreement. Fortunately, Patton, the older gentleman next door, knew the property well. He had lived there for decades. He told her that to his knowledge, no such agreement ever existed. Patton was so put off by her persistence that he came to my door one afternoon just to warn me. He said, "I think she's trying to manipulate some old maps and might be forging details to make it look like she's entitled to part of your land." I thanked him for the heads up, and we both agreed we'd keep an eye out for any more suspicious behavior on her part. As the tension rose, I decided to do my due diligence. I went to the county records office myself, pulling all documents related to my lot, the adjacent lot, and any historical notes about the area. Everything I found matched the purchase documents I already had. The warehouse and the fenced perimeter were solidly within my property lines. Absolutely no mention of a shared arrangement or common utility space. Armed with these official records, I felt confident that if Amelia ever tried to file a complaint, it would go nowhere. Still, her pushiness and refusal to drop the matter left me anxious. I ended up installing upgraded security cameras around the warehouse, along the driveway, and at the main gate, just in case. During this period, a friend of mine named Jeremiah became temporarily unemployed, so I offered him a part-time gig helping me with inventory in the warehouse. He'd come over a few mornings each week, and we'd organize materials, restock items, and generally keep the business on track. Jeremiah was a dependable guy. He was also a no-nonsense type who wouldn't hesitate to call someone out if they were up to no good. One morning, as he parked his truck, he noticed Amelia skulking around the side of my fence. She was holding some sort of measuring tape and was pressing it against the fence posts, apparently trying to measure the distance from her yard to the warehouse. Jeremiah approached her calmly, asked if she needed assistance. She spooked, sputtered some words about verifying property lines, and then hustled back to her side of the fence. When Jeremiah came inside to tell me, I shook my head in disbelief. It felt like I was dealing with someone who had become fixated on the idea that part of my property was hers, despite any and all evidence to the contrary. Eventually, Amelia escalated from mere harassment to demands and intimidation. She claimed that her father was a retired attorney with major connections, and that if I didn't comply, I would find myself locked in an expensive lawsuit that could potentially bankrupt me. She also started telling people around the neighborhood that I was blocking an easement that she said was crucial for her future home addition. No one in the neighborhood had heard of such an easement. I spoke to a few others who assured me that they didn't believe her claims. Despite the overall support from my neighbors, it was unsettling to have someone so close to my home who seemed willing to do whatever it took to get her way. Around that time, I became involved in a local woodworking club. One day a week, I'd open the warehouse to a small group of hobbyists who'd store wood planks or do small-scale projects in my space. They'd pay a nominal fee to help offset the cost of the warehouse's utilities. This was a new venture for me, meant to foster community engagement and also keep my building active and useful beyond my own contracting needs. Many members of the woodworking club were retirees who just wanted somewhere safe and accessible to store their lathe, table saw, or other equipment. Some of them were absolute masters at making furniture or carving intricate designs. It was a nice added storyline to my life, watching these skilled artisans turn raw lumber into stunning pieces of art. During one of these workshop sessions, Amelia showed up unannounced at the warehouse door. She made an attempt to wander in, but Jeremiah, who was working on a small project in the corner, intervened. He politely but firmly said, "I'm sorry, this area is private. If you're not here for the workshop or with the owner's permission, you can't be in here." She glared at him, then turned to me and demanded to know, "If you're running a public workshop, why is it okay to let strangers in but not me?" I calmly explained that our small club was purely by membership, with fees and waivers, and that it didn't entitle anyone to private gate access from an adjoining lot. Moreover, I was the one who decided who was allowed on my property, and there was a process in place that she had not gone through. She muttered something about me being uncooperative and stormed off. Days turned into weeks, and I would catch glimpses of Amelia from my security camera feed, occasionally walking along the perimeter fence. It was downright eerie. Sometimes she would stand there for several minutes, apparently staring at the warehouse or the yard. I felt uneasy every time I looked out the window and saw her, but I told myself that as long as she stayed on her side, I had little to worry about. My cameras recorded everything, so if she tried anything illegal, I'd have evidence. Still, it's not a comfortable feeling to know your neighbor is obsessively eyeing your property day after day. One Saturday morning, I decided to have a barbecue in my backyard, away from the warehouse side, to distract myself from Amelia's antics. I invited a bunch of friends, including Jeremiah, to enjoy some grilled food and good conversation. It was a pleasant day, bright and sunny. The kids of two families who came along splashed around in a small inflatable pool, while the adults mingled around the grill. Suddenly, one of my friends pointed out that someone was messing around near the side gate. Instantly, I thought of Amelia. Sure enough, the next thing I knew, I heard the sound of metal scraping against metal. Running toward the warehouse fence, I saw Amelia, along with some man I didn't recognize, brandishing what looked like bolt cutters or some heavy tool. They were attempting to cut open a portion of the chain-link fence that borders the more remote side of my property. I yelled at them to stop, and both froze in place like deer in headlights. Then Amelia, in a flustered voice, insisted, "This is part of my property. You've locked me out." I told her she was trespassing, and that if she didn't leave immediately, I'd call the authorities. Without further argument, she and the man with her scurried back onto her side. By the time the police arrived, they were gone. I filed a report, explained the property line situation, and provided the footage from my security camera that captured them clearly crossing onto my land. The officers were cordial, but said that unless something more definitive happened, like direct property damage or a clear break-in, an arrest was unlikely. They filed my report and advised me to reinforce my security measures. I followed their advice, making sure the fence was repaired, adding a tougher lock, and placing a new sign that read, "Private property, no trespassing." That night, I barely slept. The constant threat of someone trying to break in or tamper with my warehouse weighed heavily on my mind. I found myself checking the security camera feeds multiple times. Jeremiah offered to sleep over a couple of nights, but I declined, not wanting to burden him. However, he made a good point. The next time Amelia tried something, I'd have an ironclad reason to press charges. This ironically gave me a bit of solace because in a bizarre way, it was only a matter of time before she did something truly incriminating, given how relentless she was. Another subplot that came up around this time had to do with a local historical society. They reached out to me to see if they could host an old tool exhibition in my warehouse. One of their members had heard from a friend in the woodworking club that my warehouse was spacious, climate-controlled, and secure, perfect for displaying antique tools and blacksmith equipment. I was excited at the prospect of doing something so culturally enriching. We set a date for a small weekend exhibition, which meant I would need to do some extra cleaning and rearranging of the equipment. Around that same week, I caught Amelia again near the fence, apparently with a small group of her own visitors. It looked like she was giving them a tour, pointing at the warehouse. She even gestured vigorously as if telling them, "That's my building." I observed all this from inside my house, using the zoom function on the camera feed. I couldn't hear exactly what she was saying, but the mannerisms were telling. I documented the entire occurrence, saving the footage on multiple drives and in the cloud. As the Historical Society's event drew closer, I worried that Amelia might attempt to disrupt it. The day before the exhibition, some of the volunteers came by to set up tables and hang informational posters. I stationed Jeremiah near the side fence on watch, just in case. Sure enough, Amelia showed up, holding another set of what looked like new, updated maps. She walked right up to the volunteers and tried to distribute these so-called documents, telling them that the site was illegally encroaching on her property. She claimed that if they proceeded with their event, she would have no choice but to call in officials to have them evicted on the spot. One of the volunteers, a middle-aged woman named Clarice, was thoroughly confused. She came to find me inside the warehouse with the folded map in her hand, asking, "Is this for real?" I had to explain the entire saga, reassuring her that my property lines were legally sound. Clarice was relieved but shaken. She suggested that maybe the Historical Society hold the event elsewhere to avoid any potential conflict. I refused to let Amelia's intimidation tactics ruin a legitimate, carefully planned event. I told Clarice that if Amelia tried anything else, I would handle it, and the authorities would be involved if need be. The next morning, the event began as scheduled. People arrived, many from out of town, eager to see antique blacksmithing tools, early 20th century woodworking instruments, and other historical curiosities. The atmosphere was lively, with conversations about local history, old crafts, and the joys of collecting vintage hardware. Midway through the event, an agitated figure appeared at the main entrance to the warehouse. It was Amelia. She marched in and began confronting guests, demanding to know if they had permission to be there. I calmly approached her, asked her to leave, and informed her that if she stayed, she'd be trespassing. A volunteer flagged down a police officer who happened to be on duty for crowd safety. We had arranged a small police presence because we expected a decent number of visitors and needed traffic direction in the street. The officer gently guided Amelia outside after giving her a warning. She left, but not without shouting that I was ruining the neighborhood's original design. It was the first time she'd caused a scene in front of so many witnesses, though at least the officer's presence kept her from doing anything more damaging. That tense incident ended without a real resolution, but fortunately, the rest of the exhibition day went splendidly. Attendees praised the space, the artifacts, and the general organization. The Historical Society members were pleased, and I felt a sense of pride that I hadn't allowed Amelia's bizarre campaign to derail something positive for the community. That evening, after the volunteers packed up and headed home, I locked up the warehouse thoroughly. My relief that the day was over was overshadowed by a nagging fear that Amelia wouldn't let this go, and sure enough, she didn't. One of my cameras pinged me at around 2 in the morning. I had set up an alert for any motion detected around the side fence. Checking the feed on my phone, I saw a figure near the fence. The image was somewhat grainy, but I could make out Amelia's silhouette. She appeared to be holding some kind of tool again. My heart raced as I watched her move to the far corner, near where she'd tried to cut the fence before. Then, unexpectedly, the feed pixelated and I lost the live view. I assumed she might have tampered with the camera, but I also had an alternate angle from a second device. On that angle, I could see her more clearly. She was putting the tool against the fence posts, pushing, pulling, and at one point it looked like she was bashing at one section. Shocked, I called the police. They arrived in under 10 minutes, which, in the world of property damage calls, was impressively quick. By the time they shone their flashlights around, Amelia was gone, or so I thought. The responding officers, flashlights in hand, walked around the perimeter. They spotted a section of the fence that had been partially bent, but not completely broken. Wires were twisted. The top was forced open. I was sure I had footage captured on at least one camera. The officers asked if I wanted to press charges. I indicated absolutely, as I had significant reason to believe she was the culprit. We walked back toward my house to review the footage. Then one of the officers exclaimed, "Hey, is that someone behind the bushes?" Sure enough, upon shining a flashlight on a thick patch of overgrown shrubs near the fence, we found Amelia crouched down, apparently trying to hide. Her expression was one of sheer shock, like she couldn't believe she'd been discovered. The police wasted no time. They ordered her to come out. She was shaking, possibly from adrenaline, possibly from fear. They placed her under arrest for trespassing and attempted property damage. One officer asked me if I wanted to pursue the matter fully. I told them I absolutely did because this had been an ongoing problem, with multiple attempts to break through my fence. I had documented evidence. The police took her away that night. In my mind, that might have finally been the end. Surely the shock of being arrested would bring her to her senses. The next morning, I contacted my lawyer to handle any immediate legal concerns. I gave him the entire story, from the suspicious pen markings on the map to the multiple intrusions. He told me it was likely a slam dunk case, at least for property damage and trespassing. If Amelia tried to countersue claiming she owned part of my land, she'd need legitimate records, not doctored maps. My lawyer also recommended I file for a restraining order, as Amelia's repeated attempts to invade my property demonstrated a pattern of harassment and potential danger. A few days later, I learned that Amelia had spent the night in jail, but her family posted bail. According to the police, she was still facing charges, and a preliminary court date was set. I had to gather all my documentation: official property records, camera footage, incident reports, and statements from neighbors like Patton, who had witnessed her wandering around. Patton was more than willing to testify that she was making up these property lines out of thin air. Jeremiah also prepared to give a statement about the times he confronted her near the fence. I felt well supported by a community that was tired of her antics and recognized how unreasonable she was being. Around that same period, I learned that she had tried to use her father's supposed legal connections to pressure the county recorder's office into resurveying the land. Her father, who was said to be a retired lawyer, apparently demanded a special hearing to examine the property lines. However, in a case like this, where all the official surveys and deeds are perfectly clear, no hearing was going to reverse them. The county officials had no interest in entertaining the claims of someone who showed up with a pen-altered map that was in direct contradiction to registered documentation. They told her if she wanted to dispute the property line, she'd have to hire a licensed surveyor and go through the formal appeals process. That, of course, would require actual evidence. With the court date looming, Amelia began sending me letters of apology. They were bizarrely desperate. At first, she wrote things like, "It's a big misunderstanding, and I hope we can settle this calmly." Then she slipped into offering me money to install the gate anyway, though the amounts were absurdly low, certainly not enough to make me risk handing her unlimited access to my warehouse. She also included a statement that if I reconsidered, she would drop all claims and call it even. This obviously made no sense. Her claims had no legal basis, and I was the one with actual evidence against her for trespassing and vandalism. I handed these letters over to my lawyer, who simply shook his head in disbelief. When the day in court finally arrived, Amelia looked frail and jittery, as if she realized the extent of trouble she was in. The charges against her were laid out, and my legal counsel presented the evidence meticulously. The prosecutors, of course, had the security footage from my cameras, the police reports, and statements from witnesses. Amelia's defense tried to argue that she had been led to believe that the warehouse corner was indeed communal property. They showed her doctored maps as evidence, but the judge didn't buy it. The official property records from the county were crystal clear, and the extent of the pen markings, coupled with the obviously inconsistent lines, demolished any credibility her argument might have had. The judge was appalled that anyone would go to such lengths to falsify property boundaries. Ultimately, Amelia was sentenced to a mixture of probation and a short jail stint, though not an overly lengthy one. She also had to pay restitution for the damage to my fence and the associated legal fees. The judge granted me a permanent restraining order, barring her from coming within a certain distance of my warehouse and also prohibiting her from contacting me directly. If she violated that order, she'd face harsher penalties. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. After all the stress, sleepless nights, and constant worry, justice was served in a manner that reflected the seriousness of her actions. But the drama didn't end entirely there. For weeks afterward, I still felt uneasy when stepping outside. Although Amelia was no longer living in her house, she apparently relocated to an apartment a few towns away, her property sat vacant for a while, as if in limbo. I heard rumors that she tried to put it on the market, but prospective buyers were spooked by the history of legal disputes. The local rumor mill churned with tales of how she had scribbled on official maps, posted signs claiming half the neighborhood belonged to her, and tried to physically break through fences. The entire fiasco made her property nearly unsellable, or at least it brought her offers far below what she paid for it. As I heard, she'd needed to accept a loss just to be rid of the place. In the aftermath, I made it a point to strengthen my bonds with the other neighbors. We decided to form a more official neighborhood watch group, not only because of Amelia, but also to ensure we were looking out for each other in general. Patton proved instrumental in organizing monthly meetings, though they were usually just casual get-togethers where we discussed small concerns like porch thefts, road maintenance, and local community issues. By banding together, we fostered a safer, more inclusive environment. Not everything was sunshine and roses. Life has its normal ups and downs, but the overshadowing fear of having a neighbor who is persistently trying to break onto my property was gone. Another interesting subplot emerged once I felt comfortable enough to share my side of the story with the folks in the woodworking club. They were shocked to learn the full extent of Amelia's behavior. A few of them offered to help me restore the portion of the fence she damaged, bringing in their high-quality woodworking tools to refurbish the damaged gate area. We ended up building a new, more aesthetically pleasing gate on the opposite side, one that was purely for aesthetic and utility improvements, with no access to Amelia's property. It actually ended up being a nice addition, a silver lining to all the trouble she caused. Around that same time, I decided to expand the usage of the warehouse further. I rented out a small corner as a seasonal pop-up shop for a friend who sells handcrafted wooden decor around the holidays. This friend, Carla, had been struggling to find a suitable space that wouldn't break the bank in rental costs. Having a small commercial corner in my warehouse allowed her to display and sell her holiday crafts while giving me a modest extra income. We set it up so that the local community could come by on select weekends. It turned into quite a heartwarming success, with families stopping by, sipping hot cocoa, and browsing her ornaments, wreaths, and hand-carved wooden figurines. It was so far removed from the negative energy I had to deal with before that I almost felt like the entire fiasco with Amelia was in a different lifetime. I sometimes wonder what was really going on in Amelia's mind. Was she so convinced by her own fantasy that she couldn't see the overwhelming evidence against her? Did she have some plan to use the warehouse for a business of her own, or possibly rent out the space illegally? Or was she simply someone who thrived on conflict? I'll never have a definitive answer, but I've made peace with the fact that I stood my ground, protected my property, and ensured that justice was served. I hope that wherever she is now, she's getting the help or guidance she needs to understand that you can't just claim someone else's property for your own. Months after the dust settled, I received one last bizarre letter from Amelia. It was sent from an unknown address, and the return label was blank. Inside was a handwritten note in which she insisted that someday she'd prove I was right. She wrote about unseen documentation that would surface. She said I'd be sorry I didn't cooperate when I had the chance. My lawyer advised me to keep the letter as potential evidence of continued harassment, just in case. So I placed it in a file with the rest of her letters and forgot about it. That was the last I've heard from her directly. The police told me that if she approached me again, they'd be prepared to take further action, considering the restraining order. Occasionally, my friends still ask me about Warehouse Gate, as they like to call it. We share a laugh at the sheer absurdity of it all. I show them pictures of Amelia's pen-marked map, and they can't believe anyone would present that in court and try to pass it off as legitimate. Looking at it now, the difference between the official printed boundaries and her scribbles is glaring. It's almost comical, except that she tried to use them to justify property damage and a break-in. My contracting business has continued to thrive, partly because I now have a story to tell new clients who want to trust that I'm thorough and resourceful. Believe it or not, some find the whole saga oddly reassuring. They see that I was able to handle an unhinged neighbor, and they figure that I'm the kind of person who won't cut corners on a project or run off when things get tough. I guess there's a silver lining in everything. Friends, thank you. See you soon.